September 23, 1952. El Capitan Theater, Hollywood, California, 8:47 p.m. Richard Nixon sat in a folding chair on a television studio set designed to look like a modest living room. In 13 minutes, he would deliver the most important speech of his life, a speech that would either save his political career or destroy it forever. Across from him, 3 television cameras waited. Behind those cameras, an estimated 60 million Americans, the largest television audience in history at that time, were tuning in to watch. They wanted to know if Richard Nixon, the 39-year-old Republican vice presidential candidate, was a crook. 4 days earlier, the New York Post had published a story with the headline, "Secret Nixon Fund." The article claimed that wealthy California businessmen had created a secret slush fund of $18,000 for Nixon's personal use, essentially bribing him to represent their interests if Eisenhower won the presidency. The allegations were devastating. Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican presidential candidate, had built his campaign on a promise to clean up corruption in Washington. "We will drive the crooks and communists out of government," Eisenhower had declared at campaign rallies across the country. And now his running mate was accused of being exactly the kind of corrupt politician Eisenhower had promised to eliminate. For 4 days, Nixon had been in crisis. Eisenhower's advisors were demanding he withdraw from the ticket. Newspaper editorials called for his resignation. Even some Republicans were saying publicly that Nixon should step aside for the good of the party. Eisenhower himself had been maddeningly vague, refusing to either defend Nixon or ask him to resign. "Dick," Eisenhower had told him in a phone call that morning, "you need to go on television and tell your side of the story. Let the American people decide." Translation: defend yourself or you're finished. So Nixon had arranged this national television address, paying for the airtime with Republican Party funds, gambling everything on one 30-minute speech. If he could convince the American people of his innocence, he might survive. If he failed, his political career was over at age 39. What the 60 million viewers didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Nixon wasn't innocent. The fund was real, the corruption allegations had truth behind them, and Nixon was about to deliver a speech that was in large part a carefully constructed lie. But it would work. The speech would save Nixon's career and teach him a valuable lesson. In American politics, perception matters more than truth. If you can make people believe you're honest, the facts don't matter. This lesson, learned on September 23, 1952, would guide Nixon for the next 22 years. It would help him become president, and it would ultimately destroy him when he forgot that lies only work if you never get caught. This is the story of the Checkers speech, the speech that saved Nixon's career with a lie, the speech that taught him he could manipulate the American public, the speech that set him on the path to the White House and to Watergate. September 1951, 1 year before the crisis. The story actually began in 1951, when Richard Nixon was a freshman senator from California. He'd been elected in 1950 after a vicious campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas, a race where Nixon pioneered the dirty campaigning tactics that would define his career. But being a senator was expensive. Nixon had to maintain 2 residences, one in California, one in Washington, D.C. He had to travel constantly between his home state and the capital. He had to attend fundraisers, give speeches, maintain a public profile. And Nixon, unlike many of his Senate colleagues, wasn't independently wealthy. He'd grown up poor in Yorba Linda, California. His father had owned a small grocery store. Nixon had worked his way through college and law school. He had almost no personal wealth beyond his Senate salary of $12,500 per year. That's when Dana Smith approached him. Smith was a wealthy California attorney who'd supported Nixon's 1950 Senate campaign. He represented a group of Southern California businessmen, oil executives, real estate developers, defense contractors, who had significant financial interests in government policy. "Dick, you need money to do your job effectively," Smith told Nixon during a private meeting. "Let us help. We'll create a fund, contributions from successful businessmen who believe in your politics. You can use it for legitimate political expenses." "How much are we talking about?" Nixon asked. $18,000 to start, maybe more later. Nixon should have said no. Even in 1951, this kind of arrangement was ethically questionable at best, illegal at worst. Taking money from businessmen who had interests in legislation Nixon would vote on was the definition of a conflict of interest, but Nixon convinced himself it was acceptable. "This is for political expenses," he told himself. "Travel, postage, printing, nothing personal, nothing corrupt." This was the first lie Nixon told himself about the fund, because while the money was technically used for political expenses, those expenses freed up Nixon's personal salary for other things. Money is fungible. Using the fund for political costs meant Nixon's Senate salary could cover personal expenses. The practical effect was the same as if the businessmen had been paying Nixon directly, and the businessmen expected something in return. Not explicit quid pro quo, they were too sophisticated for that. But they expected access. expected that Nixon would listen to their concerns, expected that when votes came up affecting their industries, Nixon would be sympathetic. For a year, the arrangement worked quietly. Nixon used the fund for travel, for mailings to constituents, for political advertising. The businessmen who contributed got occasional meetings with Nixon, got to present their positions on legislation, got the intangible benefit of having a senator who owed them. Nobody knew about it. It was perfectly secret, until it wasn't. September 18, 1952, the story breaks. The New York Post published its exposé, just 7 weeks before the 1952 presidential election. A reporter named Leo Katcher had received a tip about the fund, and had spent weeks investigating. What he found was damning. 76 wealthy Californians had contributed to a secret fund for Nixon. The fund totaled $18,235 over 2 years. Contributors included oil executives, real estate developers, and defense contractors. Nixon had complete control over how the money was spent. There was no public disclosure, no oversight, no accountability. The headline screamed, "Secret Nixon Fund. Secret Rich Men's Trust Fund keeps Nixon in style far beyond his salary." The story went national immediately. Within 24 hours, newspapers across America were running editorials demanding Nixon's resignation from the ticket. The New York Herald Tribune, a Republican newspaper, published an editorial titled "The Proper Course for Senator Nixon," stating bluntly that he should withdraw. The political pressure was crushing. Republican Party officials were panicking. Eisenhower's campaign, built on anti-corruption themes, suddenly looked hypocritical. Democratic opponents were gleefully pointing out that the Republicans' vice presidential candidate was implicated in exactly the kind of corruption Eisenhower claimed to oppose, and Eisenhower himself refused to defend Nixon. In public, Ike said he needed to learn all the facts before making a judgment. In private, he was telling advisors, if Nixon did something wrong, he has to go. Nixon was devastated. He'd worked so hard to get on the national ticket. He'd been a senator for less than 2 years and was already running for vice president, the youngest VP candidate in generations. This was his big break, his chance at national prominence, and it was falling apart because of It's not fair, Nixon told his wife Pat on the night of September 18th. I didn't do anything wrong. That money was for legitimate political expenses. Every politician has arrangements like this. Then tell people that, Pat said. Explain it. Make them understand. But Nixon knew explaining wouldn't be enough. The fund was technically legal but ethically questionable. Explaining the technicalities would make him look like a lawyer parsing words, not an honest man defending his integrity. He needed something more, something emotional, something that would make Americans feel his honesty, rather than just hear his arguments. That's when Nixon came up with the idea for the television speech. The Checkers speech begins. My fellow Americans, Nixon began, looking directly into the camera with his characteristic intensity. I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity have been questioned. Nixon's strategy was brilliant in its manipulative simplicity. He would do 3 things. First, he would present himself as an ordinary American, not a wealthy politician. Second, he would make the speech so emotionally personal that questioning his honesty would seem cruel. Third, he would put Eisenhower in a position where asking Nixon to resign would look heartless. I want to tell you my side of the case, Nixon continued. I'm sure that you have read the charges, and you've heard it, that I, Senator Nixon, took $18,000 from a group of my supporters. Now, was that wrong? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Let me say this. Not 1 cent of the $18,000 went for my personal use. Every penny went for political expenses that I could not charge to the government. This was technically true, but misleading. Yes, the money went for political expenses, but by covering those expenses, the fund freed up Nixon's personal salary for other uses. The practical effect was the same as personal use, but Nixon didn't explain that nuance. Instead, he pivoted to emotion. Let me tell you about my financial situation, he said. When I went into the service, I had $10,000 in war bonds. That was all the savings I had. Today, I am not a wealthy man. He then proceeded to detail his finances in excruciating detail. His house in California with a $20,000 mortgage, his 1950 Oldsmobile, his life insurance policy, his debts. We have a house in Washington which cost $41,000 and on which we owe $20,000. We have a 1950 Oldsmobile car. We have our furniture. We have no stocks and bonds. That's what we have. And that's what we owe. This was the genius of Nixon's approach. By making the speech so personally detailed, he transformed a question about political corruption into a question about his family's dignity. Anyone who continued to attack him after this speech would look like they were attacking a struggling middle-class family, not confronting a possibly corrupt politician. But the masterstroke was yet to come. 20 minutes into the speech, Nixon made his famous move. One other thing I should probably tell you, he said, his voice shifting to a more informal, almost playful tone. We did get something as a gift after the election. He paused, letting curiosity build. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention that our 2 youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, The day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas, black and white, spotted. And our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. The audience watching on television could hear the warmth in Nixon's voice as he talked about his daughter and the dog. And you know the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. It was perfect, brilliant, manipulative. The speech was no longer about corruption. It was about a little girl and her dog. Anyone who criticized Nixon now would look like they wanted to take a puppy away from a 6-year-old. What Americans watching didn't know was that the dog story, while literally true, was strategically deployed to manipulate their emotions. Nixon's advisors had debated whether to include the dog story. Some thought it was too hokey, too obviously manipulative. But Nixon understood something his critics didn't. Americans don't vote based on facts and logic. They vote based on feelings. If he could make them feel that he was a good man, a family man, an honest man, the facts about the fund wouldn't matter. And he was right. September 23, 9:30 p.m., September 24th, aftermath. As Nixon finished his speech, concluding with a plea for Americans to contact the Republican National Committee to say whether he should stay on the ticket, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the RNC headquarters was flooded with telegrams, phone calls, and letters. The ratio was approximately 350 to 1 in favor of Nixon staying on the ticket. Newspapers that had called for his resignation the day before now praised his honesty and transparency. The Washington Post, which had been critical, published an editorial saying Nixon had demonstrated his essential integrity. Eisenhower, who had been coolly distant for days, called Nixon and said, "You're my boy." He arranged for Nixon to fly to meet him in Wheeling, West Virginia, where Eisenhower greeted him warmly in front of cameras, saying, "You're my boy." The Checkers speech became legendary. It was studied in political science classes as a masterclass in political communication. It saved Nixon's career and established him as a formidable national politician. But what almost nobody recognized at the time was how dishonest the speech actually was. The lies what Nixon didn't tell America. While Nixon's financial disclosure sounded comprehensive, it was actually incomplete in crucial ways. Lie 1, not 1 cent went for personal use. This was true in the narrowest technical sense, but deeply misleading. By using fund money for political expenses, Nixon freed up his Senate salary for personal use. The economic effect was the same as if he'd taken the money personally. Lie 2, the complete financial disclosure. Nixon presented himself as transparently sharing all his financial details, but he conveniently omitted several important facts. Ronhar, his wife Pat, was on his Senate payroll, earning $3,000 per year, technically legal but ethically questionable. He had recently purchased California real estate that had mysteriously appreciated in value shortly after he voted on legislation favorable to real estate developers. Some of the political expenses the fund covered were borderline personal, including clothing for television appearances and meals with supporters that were essentially personal dinners. Lie 3, the dog was a spontaneous gift. The Checkers story was literally true but strategically misleading. Nixon made it sound like the dog was a random gift from a stranger. In reality, the dog came from a wealthy supporter who had also contributed to the secret fund. It wasn't a random gift from Texas. It was part of the same network of wealthy benefactors that the scandal was about. Lie 4, every politician has arrangements like this. Nixon implied during the speech that his fund was standard practice. This wasn't true. Many politicians had campaign funds, but most were disclosed and regulated. Nixon's fund was secret and unregulated. That's what made it scandalous. But Americans watching the speech didn't know any of this. They saw a young man, barely 40 years old, standing up for his honor. They saw him talk about his modest possessions and his daughter's dog. They felt his honesty, and feelings trumped facts. What Nixon learned from the Checkers speech. The success of the Checkers speech taught Richard Nixon several lessons that would define his political career for the next 22 years. Lesson 1, emotions beat facts. Nixon learned that if you could make people feel your honesty, the actual truth didn't matter. The fund was ethically questionable at best, but by making the speech emotionally powerful, he made people believe in his innocence regardless of the facts. Lesson 2, attacks can be deflected with personal stories. By talking about his dog and his modest house, Nixon transformed a corruption scandal into a story about an ordinary family under attack. This technique, deflecting substantive criticism with personal anecdotes, became a Nixon trademark. Lesson 3, control the narrative. By giving the speech on live television, bypassing journalists, and speaking directly to Americans, Nixon controlled the message. He presented his version of events without cross-examination, without tough questions, without journalistic scrutiny. Lesson 4, you can lie if you're emotionally convincing. This was the most dangerous lesson. Nixon had been dishonest in significant ways during the speech, but because he was emotionally sincere, people believed him. He learned that you could lie as long as you didn't seem like you were lying.
These lessons served Nixon well for years. He used emotional appeals and personal stories to win the vice presidency in 1952. He used them in his failed 1960 presidential campaign. He used them in his successful 1968 campaign. But the same techniques that saved him in 1952 would contribute to his downfall in 1974, because Nixon became so confident in his ability to manipulate public perception that he stopped being careful about the truth. He started believing that as long as he could control the narrative, the facts didn't matter, and that's exactly what led to Watergate. How the 1952 Checkers speech led to the 1974 Watergate tapes. The connection between these two events, separated by 22 years, is direct and devastating. In 1952, Nixon faced a scandal based on actual misconduct, the secret fund. He responded with a speech that was emotionally powerful but factually misleading, and it worked. America forgave him. This taught Nixon that he could manipulate his way out of scandals, that emotional appeals and narrative control were more powerful than truth. For 22 years, this strategy worked. Nixon survived multiple scandals, campaign finance violations, allegations of corruption, the tricky dick reputation by using the same techniques he'd pioneered in the Checkers speech. But by 1972, Nixon had become overconfident. When the Watergate break-in happened, Nixon didn't think I should tell the truth and take responsibility. He thought, I can control this narrative. I can manipulate my way out of this. So he ordered the cover-up. He approved hush money. He destroyed evidence. He lied to investigators. He did all of this because he believed, based on 22 years of experience, that he could manage public perception, regardless of the underlying truth. But Nixon made one critical mistake. He forgot that the Checkers speech worked in 1952 because there was no recording of what actually happened with the fund. There was no hard evidence. It was his word against allegations. In Watergate, Nixon had installed a secret recording system that captured every lie, every cover-up discussion, every criminal act. He created the very evidence that would destroy him. The man who pioneered the art of political narrative control forgot that narratives only work when the truth can't be definitively proven. And by recording himself, Nixon provided the definitive proof that no amount of emotional appeals or personal anecdotes could overcome. Nixon's Checkers speech papers are released. In 1999, the Richard Nixon Library released Nixon's personal papers related to the Checkers speech. These documents revealed something that most Americans hadn't known. Nixon's advisors had written multiple drafts of the speech. They had focus grouped different arguments. They had strategically decided which financial details to reveal and which to omit. The Checkers speech, presented to America as a spontaneous, honest explanation from a man defending his honor, had been carefully scripted, strategically planned, and deliberately manipulative. Even more revealing, Nixon's personal notes from 1952 showed that he knew the fund was ethically problematic. He wrote to himself, "The fund is technically legal but looks bad. Need to change the subject from legality to character." That note revealed Nixon's entire strategy. Acknowledge the allegations, redirect to character, make it emotional, make it personal, make criticism seem cruel. It worked in 19... It made Nixon vice president, then president, but it also created the mindset that led to Watergate, the belief that perception management was more important than truth, that narrative control could overcome reality, that lies were acceptable if delivered with emotional sincerity. The Checkers speech saved Richard Nixon's career by teaching him that Americans could be manipulated. The Watergate tapes destroyed his career by proving that manipulation has limits. The speech that made him also broke him, because the techniques that worked in 1952, before recording technology, before comprehensive investigative journalism, before the modern media, didn't work in 1974. Nixon learned to lie in And the difference between those two moments is that in 1952, there was no tape. In 1974, there were hundreds of hours of tape. The Checkers speech taught Nixon he could control the narrative. The Watergate tapes proved he couldn't control the evidence. And that's the secret of the Checkers speech. It wasn't a defense of innocence. It was a masterclass in manipulation. A lesson in how to make people believe you're honest, even when you're not. Richard Nixon gave that speech on September 23, 19... He spent the next 22 years believing its central lesson, that perception matters more than truth. On August 9, 1974, he learned that lesson was wrong. When the evidence is recorded, when the truth is preserved on magnetic tape, no amount of emotional appeal can save you. The Checkers speech was Nixon's greatest triumph, and it planted the seeds of his greatest failure.